Hello everyone, and welcome to my YNR official 24 channel. Mariah's hands trembled as she stood in the doorway of the dimly lit room, the metallic glint of the pistol catching the fractured shafts of sunset filtering through the dusty blinds, and Nick and Sharon felt their stomachs plummet as the gun wavered in their direction, their daughter's eyes devoid of the warmth, humor, sarcasm, and defiant resilience that had so long been her signature, replaced instead by a cold, glassy vacancy that made Sharon's breath hitch in her throat and forced Nick to instinctively step forward with his palms out, whispering her name in a tone that teetered between disbelief and a command he didn't feel confident he could deliver, because even as he said, "Stop it, Mariah," he realized she didn't even blink, didn't even flinch, didn't even twitch in recognition, as though the sound of her own father's voice had been rerouted through some suffocating fog that Matt had carefully, meticulously constructed around her mind, and it was that realization, sharp, sudden, paralyzing, that made Sharon take a shaky step backward, not out of fear for her own safety, though the barrel of the gun was now aligned perfectly with her heartbeat, but out of terror for what had been done to her daughter, terror that someone who already carried so many old wounds, so many jagged memories of abandonment and manipulation, had once again become a target for someone's twisted control, and this time in a way that had turned her into a weapon against the two people who loved her most, even if loving her had often been a complicated thing. Sharon inhaled, praying for any sign, any flicker, any micro-expression that would tell her that Mariah was still in there somewhere behind those frozen pupils, but Matt's voice seemed to echo in their minds even without him physically present, the insidious whispers he had sunk into Mariah's fragile insecurities twisting through the air, tightening their grip around her sense of self until the daughter they knew seemed trapped behind an invisible pane of glass, pounding silently, begging to be freed, while the version of her that stood before them now began to breathe in sharp, shallow bursts that did not belong to her natural rhythm but instead mirrored the cadence of someone else's command. And Nick tried again, softer this time. "Honey, please, put the gun down, we can talk, we can fix this, we can help you." Though even as he said it he felt the horrifying truth settle heavily in his chest, that reason might not be able to penetrate whatever psychological labyrinth Matt had forced her into. Still, he held on to the sliver of paternal instinct that insisted that if he just kept talking, kept reaching, kept threading memories of love and family into his words, something might fracture the numb obedience on her face. But Mariah's grip on the gun only tightened, her knuckles whitening, her fingers rigid as though the weapon were the only solid thing she could cling to in a world that Matt had dissolved beneath her feet, and Sharon, her voice trembling, whispered, "Sweetheart, it's us, it's Mom and Dad, you know us, you love us, you don't want to do this," but the words seemed to dissipate before they reached Mariah's ears, swallowed by the static of the psychological cage that imprisoned her, and whether it was the flicker of despair in Sharon's voice or the subtle shift in Nick's stance that triggered it, the gun suddenly jerked upward, the movement sharp, mechanical, terrifying, and Nick felt his pulse slam into overdrive as he realized that he and Sharon were no longer dealing with Mariah's hesitation but with Matt's programming, Matt's calculated cruelty, Matt's perverse enjoyment of turning vulnerability into violence, and for a heartbeat, just one, there was silence so thick it seemed to absorb the air, and in that silence Nick saw a glimmer in Mariah's eyes, a tiny spark of confusion, a small sputter of the real her as though she were clawing her way to the surface, desperately trying to resist the instruction echoing in her mind, but then her face went still again, chillingly still, and Sharon, feeling tears prick the corners of her eyes, whispered again, "Mariah, please," and Nick saw her hands subtly move behind her back, searching for her phone, for anything, for any method of intervention that did not rely solely on hope, but before fingers could close around the device, Mariah's arm jerked, the gun fired, and the sound of the shot was deafening, a violent crack that seemed to split the world open. Nick felt a surge of burning pain explode through his shoulder as he stumbled backward, collapsing into the wall, his breath punched out of him in a hoarse gasp while Sharon screamed his name, her hands flying toward him before instinct forced her to stagger back again as the gun swung toward her, and Mariah who had once cried on Sharon's shoulder, teased Nick mercilessly, protected her siblings like a lioness, laughed until she snorted at family dinners, stood over them with the posture of a stranger, an agent of someone else's will, her breath hitching in small, robotic pulses as if even breathing had been choreographed by Matt's sinister conditioning, and Sharon, torn between going to Nick and trying once more to reach their daughter, tried to say something, anything, that might break the spell, but her words collided with Mariah's mechanical blankness, and Nick, clutching his bleeding shoulder, forced himself upright, driven by a combination of adrenaline, paternal desperation, and a refusal to let his daughter be consumed by this darkness. And he croaked out, "Mariah, look at me," and for the briefest moment she did, her eyes locking onto his, and in them Nick thought he saw a crack, a fracture, a tiny shard of his daughter screaming silently for help, and it was enough, just enough, for him to muster the strength to take a step toward her, but then something in her expression snapped back into place, rigid, cold, merciless, and she raised the gun again. Sharon's heart lurched as she understood that reasoning might no longer be possible and that every second was a struggle against whatever psychological chains Matt had welded into her daughter's mind, and in that moment Sharon made a choice, a fierce, maternal, gut-wrenching choice to put her own body between Mariah and Nick, because if one of them had to fall again it would not be Nick, not with the blood already soaking through his shirt, not with the pain carved so deeply into his features, and as she stepped in front of him she whispered a trembling but determined, "It's okay, Nick," even though nothing about this moment was okay, even though her entire body shook with fear and grief and an unbearable ache for what Mariah was being forced to become, and for a second the room seemed suspended in time, all three of them locked in a tableau of terror, love, and betrayal, until another shot shattered the stillness, the force of it slamming Sharon backward, her hand flying to her side as she gasped in shock, her legs buckling, and Nick caught her as best he could with one arm, crying out her name, his voice breaking with desperation as she sagged against him, and Mariah stood frozen, the gun still raised, her expression flickering wildly now, as though some part of her consciousness was struggling violently against the implanted commands, the cracks widening, her breathing accelerating into erratic gulps as she stared at what she had done, at the parents bleeding before her, at the chaos that Matt had orchestrated through her hands, and at last a small, strangled sound escaped her throat, a whisper of a sob. The first true sign of the real Mariah clawing her way back, and Nick, even through his agony, saw it and choked out, "Mariah, baby, fight it," and for a moment it looked as though she might drop the gun, her fingers twitching, loosening, her eyes filling with a shimmering glaze of horror and recognition, but then the invisible tether of Matt's control yanked violently at her psyche again and she staggered, clutching her head, torn between obedience and awakening, while Nick and Sharon, bleeding, terrified, but refusing to give up, continued to call to her with every last ounce of love and hope they could muster, because even in the face of gunfire, even in the face of a nightmare none of them could have imagined, they believed their daughter was still in there, fighting to come home. Mariah's breath came in ragged, uneven shudders as she stumbled backward, the gun still clutched in her trembling hand, her expression contorting into something halfway between terror and rage, though neither emotion belonged to her entirely. They flickered and vanished like signals struggling through static, as though two versions of her, the real daughter who once cried at old movies and teased Faith relentlessly, and the constructed puppet Matt had engineered from the hollow spaces of her insecurities, were warring violently inside her skull, and Nick watched every second of that internal battle with a desperation so fierce it nearly drowned out the agony radiating through his injured shoulder, his arms slick with blood, but he forced himself to stay upright, supporting Sharon as she sagged against him, her breathing shallow, her hand pressed against her bleeding side, and though pain twisted through her features she met his gaze with a silent message, "Don't give up on her, because..." Even as her vision blurred at the edges and the room swayed dizzily, she understood something instinctively, Mariah was teetering, dangerously, precariously, between total collapse and total control, and whichever side claimed her in the next moments might decide whether anyone in this room survived. Mariah's fingers spasmed around the gun, lifting it, lowering it, lifting it again as her mind whiplashed between Matt's commands and her own rising horror, and she let out a strangled cry, a fractured, guttural sound that didn't resemble her voice at all, a sound that made Sharon flinch not out of fear but grief, because hearing her daughter's suffering so raw, so unfiltered, so violently pulled from her soul, hurt more than the wound in her side. Nick swallowed hard and stepped a shaky foot forward, still holding Sharon securely, and said in a hoarse, trembling voice, "Mariah, sweetheart, listen to me. You're stronger than whatever he put in your head. You're stronger than Matt. You're stronger than this," and the way he said stronger carried a father's certainty, a father's history of watching his daughter fight through every hell life threw at her, identity, abandonment, trust, self-worth, and rise again, and maybe it was that weight, that conviction, that made Mariah's lip tremble as her eyes squeezed shut, her breathing escalating into desperate gulps as she jerked the gun away from them as though the mere sight of her parents bleeding on the floor seared her skin. With unbearable guilt, Sharon, wincing as she shifted, whispered, "Mariah, baby, look at us," and slowly, agonizingly, she opened her eyes, and this time there was more of her in them, fearful, devastated, horrified, but her, and for one miraculous second, Sharon allowed herself to hope that the spell was breaking, but then a violent convulsion tore through Mariah's body, her back arching, her fingers tightening sharply on the gun as though controlled by an electric impulse, and she shook her head rapidly, clawing at her temple with her free hand, her voice cracking as she gasped, I can't stop, he's still," and the sentence dissolved into a broken sob, and Nick felt something inside him snap, not anger, but fury at Matt, fury at the invasive poison he had embedded in Mariah's mind, fury at the way he had taken their daughter's vulnerabilities and weaponized them until she could no longer trust her own thoughts. "Mariah," Nick said firmly, summoning every ounce of strength as he straightened his spine despite the pain stabbing through him, "listen to me. He's not here. Matt's not here. You're not alone in your head. Not anymore. Fight him. Fight him like you fought every single thing that ever tried to break you." And for a moment she seemed to hear him, really hear him, because her eyes widened with a flicker of realization, then confusion, then determination, and her grip trembled violently as though the gun were burning her hand and she wanted desperately to drop it but couldn't yet override the command embedded in her mind, and Sharon, tears streaking her face through the pain, whispered, "We love you, sweetheart. We love you so much. Come back to us." Those words, "come back to us," seemed to strike something deep in Mariah, something buried but not dead, because she let out a choking gasp, her knees buckling as she staggered and slammed her back against the wall, her eyes darting around the room in panic as though she were trapped inside her own body, and she whispered, "I'm trying. Mom, Dad, I'm trying," her voice shaking with every ounce of terror and despair she had been holding inside. Nick felt Sharon's weight grow heavier against him and fear jolted through him. She was losing blood, too much blood, yet he couldn't move toward the phone on the table, couldn't put distance between himself and Mariah, couldn't take the risk of triggering any reflex conditioned into her by Matt, so he kept whispering her name, kept pushing his voice through the fog surrounding her senses, kept pleading, kept reaching and reaching even though each breath sent lightning bolts of agony through his shoulder. The lights overhead flickered as the sun finally dipped below the horizon, plunging the room into darker shadows, and in that dimness Mariah looked even more haunted, her silhouette trembling as she pressed her palms so hard to her forehead that her nails bit into her skin, and she muttered, he told me you'd lie. He said you'd try to stop me, said you didn't want me, said," she choked, voice breaking, "said you never did," and Sharon inhaled sharply, the pain in her chest suddenly. Nothing compared to the agony of knowing Matt had twisted Mariah's oldest fears, those wounds that had lingered for years, the sense she had always struggled with, the fear of being unwanted, and had turned them into chains. "Mariah," Sharon whispered, her voice cracking, "that's not true. None of it is true. You are wanted. You are loved. More than you know." But the words barely left her mouth before Mariah jerked violently again, her arms snapping up as the gun wavered toward them uncontrollably, and she screamed, a raw, primal scream of pain and resistance, as though her body were split between two masters, and Nick instinctively shielded Sharon with his own body, ready to take the next bullet if it meant giving Mariah one more second to break free, but the shot didn't come. Instead, Mariah dropped to her knees, the gun still clutched in her hand but no longer raised, her entire body shuddering as she sobbed uncontrollably, and Nick felt a surge of hope crack through the terror, she was fighting, she was resisting, she was clawing her way back. "Mariah," he whispered again, softer now, gentler, as though speaking to the younger version of her who used to hide behind sarcasm to protect her heart, "you're not what he made you. You're stronger than this. Drop the gun. You can do it." And for a moment her head lifted, her tear-filled eyes locking onto his, and the anguish carved into her expression was so deep it looked almost physical, and she whimpered, I don't want to hurt you again. I didn't mean to. I didn't." Her voice cracked into another sob and the gun trembled, lowered another inch, and Sharon, clutching Nick for balance, whispered, "Then let go, sweetheart. Just let go." But before she could, a sudden wave of pain rippled through her again, her spine arching sharply, the gun jerking upward as her muscles spasmed under Matt's mental conditioning, and she gasped in horror, he's still in my head, he won't let me," and the sentence dissolved into a scream as she fought against the invisible grip trying to force her hand to rise. Nick took a shaky step toward her despite the blood dripping down his arm, his voice firm even though he felt faint. "Mariah. Look at me. You are not his. You are ours. You are yours. You get to decide. Drop the gun." She shook violently, her knuckles white, her breath wheezing, and then, at last, something shifted. Her fingers twitched. Her grip weakened. Her hand opened an inch, then another, and the gun slipped from her grasp, clattering loudly onto the floor as she collapsed forward onto her hands, sobbing so hard her entire body shook. Nick exhaled shakily, relief flooding him, even as the room around them seemed to tilt and spin from pain and blood loss. Sharon leaned heavily against him, her voice barely audible as she whispered, "Mariah, thank God," but the moment was not yet safe. The moment teetered on a fragile edge. Because Mariah, even disarmed, continued to tremble violently, her hands clutching the floorboards as she gasped for breath, tears dripping onto the wood, her voice cracking as she whispered, "I didn't mean it. I didn't want to. I didn't want to hurt you. I didn't," and Nick, ignoring his pain, moved slowly toward her, slow, deliberate, non-threatening, while Sharon sank to her knees beside him despite her injury, both parents reaching out to her as though their touch might anchor her back into herself. And when Nick's fingers brushed her arm, Mariah flinched as though burned, crying out, Don't touch me, I don't deserve, I hurt you, I shot you," but Nick shook his head fiercely, pulling her into his good arm despite the agony that ripped through him, holding her as she trembled and sobbed, whispering, "You're my daughter. Nothing you do will ever change that. Nothing Matt did can take you away from us." And slowly, as though inch by inch reclaiming her own body, Mariah collapsed into his embrace, her sobs muffled by his shirt as she clung to him with desperate, agonized strength, and Sharon wrapped her arms around both of them despite the searing pain in her side, tears slipping down her cheeks as she whispered, "We're here. We're here. We're not going anywhere." The room felt suspended again, not in terror this time, but in the fragile, trembling relief of a family holding itself together through sheer will, blood pooling on the floor around them, the discarded gun lying harmlessly beside them, and the darkness outside pressing against the windows as though acknowledging the battle fought and won inside this home. But it wasn't over. Not yet. Because though Mariah had dropped the gun, though she was in their arms, though she was sobbing with the raw grief of someone finally breaking free, Matt's shadow still lingered in her trembling, her flinching, her fragmented breaths, and Nick and Sharon knew with chilling certainty that the scars he had carved into her mind would not vanish simply because she had managed to resist him once. But for now, here, in this moment, the only thing that mattered was that she was alive, she was herself, and she was in their arms, and they would face whatever came next together, bleeding but unbroken, terrified but united, shaken but still a family fighting to pull each other out of the dark.